So I'm speaking to you from Kamloops, BC. So I'm on the traditional lands of the Kamloops to Secwépemc people within the unceded territory of the Secwépemc Nation. So as we come together today to discuss grasslands, I'd like to acknowledge our traditional hosts and the wealth of ecological knowledge that are held by Indigenous people in Canada, and especially within grassland systems, this being a system that's very important to Indigenous people. And so today, when Christy said Grasslands 101, I thought, well, I'll try and give a high-level overview in the 20 minutes, speaking a little bit about what grasslands are, where we find them, and then trying to move into a little bit of discussion on the grasslands values and some threats and challenges we have in conserving these grassland ecosystems. Oh, there we go. So a good place to start is, how do we define grasslands? Most people go, well, this seems very simplistic. I mean, grasslands are clearly areas that are dominated by grasses, which is true. And generally, the grasses will be there, but we'll also have grass lakes, which are sedges and rushes. And we'll also have a variety of forbs. So these are those broader net-like veined species, broad leaves, flowers, the wildflowers we see out in those systems. But the other thing is, if you look up definitions of grasslands, you'll actually find a lot of diversity. And sometimes people considered areas that we've cultivated and planted to grasses as grasslands. So for the context of today's presentation, I'm really going to focus on areas that are native or natural grassland systems. And so they're made up mainly of Indigenous species. They're what would exist here without settlement and disturbance. So we're going to focus on those native systems. So I wanted to start with kind of a big picture look and look globally. So if we divide our terrestrial ecosystems up across the globe into different vegetation components, we can classify these out as biomes. So you see on this map here, we have about 9 different biomes, the way they've broken them down here. And Christy, can you see my mouse when I move it?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So you can see here that, this brown system, the savanna system, that we find that kind of near the equator. And that another system we have here, this orange system, is our temperate grassland system. So we find that more kind of in more temperate areas. And for the context of how you can define grasslands different ways, but I like to incorporate savanna and temperate grassland systems into how I look at grasslands at a global level. So if we look at this a little bit more closely, if we look at our savanna systems here on the right, savanna systems are kind of found near the equator. Often they're called tropical savannas or tropical grassland systems. They tend to be in areas where we have a true kind of wet and dry season. There tends to be a little bit more moisture in those systems, so that they do have kind of a tree cover, but it'll be a very open canopy. And the understory is still dominated by grasses. Now, if we want to look at temperate grasslands, which is really what I'm going to focus my discussion on today, we're looking at these areas that are found more in places where we have continental climates. So we have kind of colder winters, but we can have these hot, dry summers. And that's where we find these temperate grasslands. And they're called many different things. We call them prairies, we call them steppe systems, veldts, and different names depending on where you are globally. And in this bottom picture here, this is just right here is Kamloops. So you can see when you ever go and Google Earth, you can easily see grasslands by their color. They show up quite easily. And so you can see this is a temperate grassland system here where I live. But if you look at this picture above, this is in Mongolia. And I had the opportunity to go to Mongolia a while back and look at their rangeland systems, and specifically some of their grassland areas. And even though they're very far from us, the system there is very similar, and again is classified as a temperate grassland. So when we look at our biomes, we can further, they really break down based on 2 main climatic factors. One is the annual precipitation. So on this axis, you can see the annual precipitation here. And on the bottom, you can see average temperature. And what you'll notice with grasslands, here's our temperate grasslands and our tropical grasslands, is that they span a wide range of temperatures. So again, the tropical tend to be these hotter systems. Temperate has a fairly wide temperature range. But what is found with both of them is that they are in fairly low moisture, low precipitation environments. So they tend to be drier. And that's why grasses are more successful there than trees in those situations. So if I went out on the street and asked people what the most endangered terrestrial ecosystem was, kind of like Rick Myers on the street, probably I would get what's terrestrial. And the second would be, it would probably be rainforests or old growth forests. But if you look at the information out there, in fact, temperate grasslands are the world's most altered terrestrial ecosystem on the planet. And on most continents, they are the most endangered ecosystem. And I don't think we get enough press. I don't think people realize the value and how important these grassland systems are. And the other thing that I wanted to point out was that they're really important in terms of carbon sequestration. And people often look at forested ecosystems and talk about how important they are in storing and sequestering carbon. But if you look at grasslands, they're storing a large amount of carbon. And on the right here, this is a picture of a range agrologist, or retired range agrologist now from Alberta, Barry Adams, and he's holding a rough fescue plant. And you can see all of that root material, more than 50% of that plant is below ground. And that's where that carbon's being stored. So it's being stored in all of that root material and all of the litter that's decomposing and going into the ground. So the one advantage is if we have a fire go through a grassland system, yes, it releases some carbon from the top material, but those roots stay underground. So they're a very good way to sequester carbon. What does release the carbon is if we don't manage them properly, or if we cultivate them. If we plow them up, then that's going to decompose, that carbon's going to be released. Oh, went backwards there. Now let's move into looking at North America, and we can further break down our temperate grassland systems that we have in North America based on different plant associations. So if we move out to kind of the east, we're looking at the taller true grass prairie. This is a system that had quite a bit of moisture in it, so it has fairly high productivity. Hence it's called tall, because you can support a lot of vegetation. If you moved kind of west of it, you get into mixed and then short grass prairie. It's in a rain shadow, so a little bit drier, and you get less production. We move way down here to the bottom. We can have our coastal prairie system. Unfortunately, almost all of that is gone. Very little of that remains now. If we're looking at kind of South United States and at the top of Mexico, our really hot, dry grassland system called the Desert Plains Grassland System. In California, we have the Pacific Prairie. It used to be more of a perennial grassland system, but it's now dominated a lot by annual grasses. And if you move up to where we are in BC, you see this little piece extending here and here. And we're part of what is known, using this type of association grouping, as the Palouse Prairie System. And I'm going to focus in more on our grassland system within BC. So in a North American context, if we look at kind of what's happening with our grasslands, it's a little bit of a good news, bad news story. So on the left, you can see here, I'm showing you cultivated areas. So if you look, all of this orange is showing you grassland areas that have now been cultivated. So have gone under the plow, which is one of our main losses to grassland systems. And if you look, you'll notice a lot of that's falling where we would have seen the tall grass prairie, because that had a lot of moisture, and that would be, when European settlement occurred, those were places that we went to first to kind of homestead and start growing agricultural crops. So much of that has been lost. But if you look on the right, here I'm showing you in green some of the intact areas, and grasslands are kind of this color, limey green here. And so we still have intact grasslands, more so in the short grass and kind of drier prairie system. But even there, it's been fairly heavily fragmented, meaning that we don't have a lot of really large intact pieces in place. And if we move to a national, looking just at Canada, it's also a little bit of a good news, bad news story. If we look at our prairie grasslands, we've lost most of those. And that's basically because a lot of those areas have been cultivated and moved into agricultural use. So, if you look at these circles here, a lot of red, greater than 70% loss, and our tall grass prairie, there's very little remaining. But if you look at British Columbia and our grasslands here, we call these, they're talking about bunch grass sagebrush systems, we still have a lot remaining. And so from a conservation standpoint, we have land that exists. And can we move forward and make sure that we help conserve and protect that? So let's look a little bit about where we find grasslands and what influences them. And I'm really going to focus in now on just looking at grassland systems within British Columbia. Before I start, I wanted to point out some resources. Over here is, this is the front page of a book called The Grasslands of British Columbia. And this is a publication by Brian and Sandra Wakeem. It was put out in 2004. It is an excellent document that has 800 pages of really great detail on grasslands in BC. So if you're interested in knowing more about grasslands on British Columbia, go to this source. And you can find this and many other excellent sources free for use on the GCC website. So if you go to their resources page here, you'll be able to click on this and you can download it as a PDF. So lots of excellent information out there. And a lot of the information that I'm presenting today comes from some of these sources. So this shows a map of where we find grasslands in BC. So the yellow area is our grassland area. You see a lot in kind of the central part of the province, a little bit in the Kootenay Trench, and some scattered up north. Less than 1% of our province is now native grasslands, but they have very high habitat value, and they're home to over 30% of our species at risk. So a lot of values. What I want to show you here is if you look at Google, you can see our grassland system here. It shows up light, but you can see how it extends down into Washington and Oregon and Idaho. So truly our grassland systems in BC, we're more connected north to south than we are if we went across the Rocky Mountains into the prairie ecosystem. So we're all part of that larger association that before I mentioned, sometimes called the Palouse Prairie. And we're also sometimes called a shrub steppe grassland system. So typically we find grassland in areas where moisture is limiting. Grasses do better and can be the dominant species on sites where there's a moisture deficit. So if you look at this map, it's showing you, here's the mean annual temperatures in British Columbia, and where you see orange or red, that is hot. And on the right, you see mean annual precipitation. And again, where you see orange or red, that means low precipitation and so dry. So if you take those and lay them on top of each other, grasslands really come at those places where we have higher temperatures and lower precipitation. So it's more of a combination, and it really relates to evapotranspiration and the amount of moisture that is in that system and what it can maintain. So grasses are very well adapted to growing in areas where there are moisture limitations. The other thing that's really important within our grassland systems in BC is the impact that topography plays on where we find them. So orographic influence is just a fancy way of saying a rain shadow effect. And because we have a lot of mountain ranges that run north to south, and our weather usually moves, coming off of the Pacific in the west here, and as the systems move up, the moisture is released on this side, so Vancouver's getting all of the rain. Once those clouds come down the lee side, the back side of the mountain, they don't have as much moisture left in them. So we get this rain shadow effect kind of in the back side of the mountain. And that's why we're a lot drier in Kamloops than you are in Vancouver. Now, if you look at this provincially, like I said, we have all of these mountain ranges that run north to south, and our weather patterns tend to come west to east. So in the lee side of all these mountains on the backside, we often get these dry areas, and that's where we have these grasslands here and these grasslands here forming. So topography does play a role in altering precipitation. We can further break our grasslands down in BC into kind of different communities based on the idea of temperature and on moisture. So here on the bottom, we have, hot systems, and you'll notice that we often call our grasslands by names that relate to elevation. So lower, middle, and upper. And if we move up into kind of our colder systems, you can see we move up into ponderosa pine. So there's some tree cover, higher elevation. And then at the top here, we have alpine grasslands, which have different constraints that allow grasses to be dominant in those systems. So I want to take you on a little bit of a tour of some of our grasslands and really look at lower, middle, and upper. I'm going to take you on a tour in Kamloops, so it's going to be somewhat specific to this area. The plant community dominance will change depending where we are in the province. The lower grasslands here are our hottest and driest ecosystems. And then as we move up to middle and upper, what we're really seeing is a decrease in temperatures and a little bit more moisture. So it's an elevational gradient, but what it's really causing is a moisture gradient. So we get more moisture as we go up, and that starts to change which plants are more successful in those environments. So I'm going to take you on a tour of Lac du Bois grasslands. I know some of you have definitely been there, but not everybody watching is in Kamloops. And so this is a place I take students all the time, and we will start over here, and we can move up through our grasslands on an elevational gradient right up into the tree line. So in something like around 15 kilometers, we can go through all of those different systems. So our lower grasslands are hot and dry systems. And what we see within these systems that they tend to be more of a shrub bunchgrass community. Our dominant species are blue bunch wheatgrass up here. And we also have big sage, a native shrub that grows in those areas. And if you look at these sites, what you'll see is there's a lot of spaces between the plants. And it's because there's only so much moisture there. So it can only maintain so much productivity. So there's roots underground trying to take up that moisture, but there's spaces above. But it's not open bare ground. You can see that here there's a biological crust on it. So in healthy grassland systems, that crust plays an important role in protecting the soil, and it has other functions as well. As we move up to the middle grasslands, we're getting slightly more precipitation and lower temperatures, so more effective moisture overall. Sage starts to drop out, and we see higher levels of productivity, so more biomass, more growth. And we'll see a lot more diversity. And, you know, we have beautiful forbs and wildflowers in the lower grasslands too, but this is just showing you some of the diversity that you can see in an upper grassland site. And if you go to these systems in the spring, they're very beautiful. And every week you'll see different forbs that'll be flowering. We move to the upper grasslands, again, another drop in temperature, a little bit more moisture, and we see, again, an increase in productivity. And one of our dominant grasses here in Kamloops area in the upper grasslands is rough fescue. So a very large, long-growing bunch grass. And I dug these out in the field, and we had a field trip this weekend. We did the same thing. And you can see as we go from the lower grasslands to the middle to the upper, that the color of the AH horizon, which is the top level of the soil, becomes darker. And it's really to do with that moisture gradient, that we have more plants, more root material growing these upper. So you get that darker color because of all that organic matter. That's why places like the tall grass prairie that had, that were black Chernozemic soils were very highly cultivated, because they make nice agricultural land if you can supplement them with moisture. I don't want to forget about alpine grasslands. We find these in systems where we're above the tree line, and generally here it's that you have restrictions to tree growth because of shorter growing seasons, winds, and colder temperatures. But these have some really beautiful forbs and wildflowers and grass species growing in these areas as well. And then we also have savanna systems within BC. They're not true tropical savanna systems, but they have enough moisture to sustain an open canopy, but we'll have an understory dominated by grasses. Sometimes fire regimes play a role here too. We have things like the ponderosa pine ecosystem, and on Vancouver Island, we have the Garry Oak savanna ecosystem. So I want to move on to values, threats, and challenges, just briefly. Grasslands have lots of different values and uses. So I've already said they're important in terms of ecosystem services and carbon sequestration, capturing and holding water. They're important in terms of habitat for many species. We have uses such as domestic livestock grazing. The plants have medical and cultural value to Indigenous people. So there's a variety of uses and values within these systems. But we have challenges in terms of maintaining them. So I'll just highlight a few. This is recreation. And Recreation use doesn't mean just motorized vehicles, mountain biking, hiking. Any impact of us being out there can have negative impacts on these systems if not done properly. So what I think is important is that not that we should be removing recreation from grasslands. I think people out there experiencing these landscapes is wonderful. It's just that we need to do it in an educated, informed way and make sure we're doing it in a sustainable way and not causing problems like invasive species spread. One thing that the GCC was involved in was developing this literature and information about off-road vehicle use within grasslands and helping to educate people about how to recreate responsibly within these systems. Because our recreation numbers will continue to rise. Another huge challenge is development. And I mean, Kamloops, it's a riparian area and grassland area that we built our communities on. So we're losing grasslands to development for housing, and also we're losing grasslands to development for agricultural purposes. So down in the more southern part of the interior, or kind of southern part of BC, there's been a lot of grasslands that are now, they make perfect areas for vineyards and grape production. And so those grasslands are now being cultivated. This is kind of a harder challenge to deal with because as we put pressures and grow out into these systems, we don't have a lot of grassland left. So one way to kind of help direct this is to educate people, and especially developers and local governments, about the value of grasslands. The GCC has been very involved in mapping priority grasslands and letting people know where really high value systems are, and giving information to local governments to help in terms of looking at this when they're doing their planning and development. Invasives, unfortunately, are a problem, I think, in almost every ecosystem that we have, and this is especially true within grassland systems. These are species that don't come from here, they come from elsewhere, they don't have known predators here, and they find a niche and they expand. So understanding how we can deal with these is really important, and there's a lot of ongoing research, but one way is just trying to protect the areas in the first place. I also wanted to add in that grasslands are disturbance-based ecosystems, so they have evolved under disturbance. They've evolved under grazing pressure, and they've evolved under fairly frequent fire intervals. And so since European settlement, we've definitely altered those things, especially fire and suppressing it in areas. So there is more discussion at looking at getting fire back on the landscape in some of these systems, especially if we have issues like tree encroachment. So that was, in a little over 20 minutes, a very kind of short summary. I mean, the key takeaway message is these grassland ecosystems are very important. They're rare and endangered systems, temperate grasslands especially. They have a host of numerous ecosystem services and values to us. And so it's really important to conserve and manage these systems appropriately. And I truly believe one of the best ways that we can do this is through raising awareness and education about these systems so that people understand how to use these areas responsibly. And people can email me, but as well, I would suggest people check out the Grassland Conservation Council website, because that's really one of the main mandates of the GCC, is about raising education and awareness on grassland systems.